He came to say goodbye to his ex-wife, only to find two little girls at her grave who called her Mommy, and looked exactly like him. The summer heat clung to the air like a memory that wouldn't fade as Jonathan Blake stepped out of his black car, the gravel crunching softly beneath his polished shoes. The cemetery was quiet, shaded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze, and the sky above was a cloudless, pale blue. Dressed in a crisp blue suit, his jacket open and tie slightly loosened, Jonathan looked nothing like the grieving man he was trying to become. His chestnut brown hair was neatly styled, his brown eyes calm on the surface, but underneath that expensive fabric and cool demeanor, he felt something churning. It had been over 5 years since he had last seen Emily, and in all that time, he had kept their past locked tightly away, buried under mergers, private jets, and boardrooms. But death has a way of unlocking doors you thought were sealed for good. He hadn't even known she was sick. The news of her passing had come not from a friend or family member but from a former classmate who messaged him after seeing the obituary online. She had been living quietly in the town where they'd once started their life together, before everything fell apart, before ambition pulled him one direction and grief the other. He didn't come back for the funeral. He couldn't. Maybe he was a coward. Maybe he thought too much time had passed. But when the weight of it caught up with him weeks later, he found himself unable to breathe until he finally got in the car and made the 3-hour drive from the city, telling himself it was just to say goodbye, nothing more. As he walked between the rows of headstones, scanning names etched in stone, he felt time folding in on itself. The last time he was here, they had been picking out burial arrangements for her mother. Now, here he was, alone, approaching the grave of the woman he once promised forever to, and abandoned before their future could even begin to heal. But it wasn't the name on the grave that stopped him in his tracks. It was the two small figures kneeling beside it. He saw them from a distance at first, two little girls, maybe 5 years old, with matching brown hair pulled into low pigtails and wearing red sweaters that looked far too warm for the summer air. They were whispering softly to each other, wiping their eyes with the sleeves of their sweaters. One of them was clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. The other was holding what looked like a folded piece of paper. Jonathan hesitated, unsure if he was intruding. But something compelled him forward. As he stepped closer, the girls looked up, startled by the sudden presence of a stranger. Their eyes, big, round, and unmistakably familiar, locked onto his, and something inside his chest shifted painfully. "Hi," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. "Are you here to visit someone?" One of the girls nodded slowly. "This is our mommy's grave," she said, her voice fragile but clear. Her name was Emily. He froze. The world around him seemed to fall away in a blur of heat and stillness. "Emily Blake?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," the other girl said. "She was our mom." Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. His breath caught. It wasn't possible. Emily had never told him she was pregnant. They had separated suddenly, too many arguments, too much distance. He had never once considered that there might have been something, or someone, left behind. He dropped to one knee, suddenly aware that his legs were trembling. "How old are you two?" he asked. 5, they said in unison. And with that word, 5, everything fell into place. 5.5 years since the divorce. 5 years since he'd walked away. 5 years since he'd lost more than he realized. He looked at their faces again, at the curve of their cheeks, the shape of their eyes. There was no denying it. They weren't just her daughters. They were his. Jonathan didn't move for what felt like a full minute. The girl stood just a few feet away, watching him with curiosity and a hint of wariness, the way children do when they sense that an adult doesn't quite know what to do next. His mind raced, trying to fit the impossible into something rational. Emily had never called. Never written. Never said a word. How could she have kept this from him? But more than that, how had he not noticed? Not suspected? In all the silence between them, there had been something deeper, something he'd chosen not to explore because it had hurt too much. Now the truth stood in front of him with matching eyes and tiny voices. He glanced down at the grave again, and for the first time since arriving, he really saw it. The headstone was simple, modest, engraved with Emily's full name and the words, "Beloved Mother, Brave Heart." No mention of a husband. No mention of him. The guilt hit him harder than he expected. And alongside it, a new fear crept in. What had these girls been told about him? Did they know who he was? He cleared his throat gently, trying to steady his voice. "What are your names?" The girl with the flowers stepped forward. "I'm Sarah. And that's my sister, Sophie." He nodded slowly, repeating their names in his head like a prayer. "Sarah and Sophie," he said quietly. "Those are beautiful names." "Mommy picked them," Sophie said, still holding the folded paper tightly in her hand. Jonathan gestured softly toward it. "What's that you're holding?" "It's a letter," she replied. "We wrote it to Mommy." "Would you mind if I sat with you for a bit?" he asked. The girls exchanged a quick glance and then both shrugged. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. He lowered himself to sit on the edge of the small concrete border surrounding the grave, suddenly unsure of what to do with his hands or his eyes. The silence felt heavy, but not empty. "I knew your mom," he said finally. "A long time ago." Sarah tilted her head. "You were friends?" Jonathan hesitated. "We were, more than that, once. We were married." Both girls looked up at him sharply, eyes wide. Sophie blinked. "You were our mommy's husband?" "Yes," he said quietly. "A long time ago. Before you were born." They were silent, and he wondered if they were old enough to process what he had just told them. Then Sarah asked the question that made his stomach twist. "Why weren't you with her?" There it was, raw and simple. No judgment, just confusion. He didn't know how to answer without telling them things they were too young to understand. "It's complicated," he said gently. "But I made mistakes. I didn't know about you. If I had," he swallowed hard, "things would have been different." Sarah didn't respond right away, but Sophie looked down and whispered, "We don't have anyone else." Jonathan looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" She glanced at her sister, as if waiting for permission to continue. Then she said, "Mommy got sick. She tried to stay strong for us, but she got tired. After she died, we stayed with Miss Diane, our neighbor. But she says she can't take care of us much longer." Jonathan felt something break inside him. These weren't just two children mourning a parent. They were two children on the edge of being left behind. "Where is Miss Diane now?" he asked. "She dropped us off," Sarah said. "She said she'd come back later, but we've been waiting a long time." Jonathan looked around, suddenly uneasy. There were no other visitors nearby, no sign of an adult watching over them. The thought that these two 5-year-olds had been left alone in a cemetery was almost too much to process. He stood slowly, pulling out his phone. "Can I call someone for you? Maybe Miss Diane?" Sarah shook her head. "We don't know her number." Jonathan crouched down so he was eye level again. "Would you feel okay coming with me for a little while? Just until we find her. I won't do anything without asking first, I promise." The girls looked at each other. Sophie nodded first, then Sarah. "Okay," she said. He offered a hand to each of them, and they took it, small fingers wrapping around his with surprising trust. As they walked back toward his car, Jonathan glanced over his shoulder at the grave one more time. The questions were piling up faster than he could answer them. Why had Emily kept this secret? How had no one reached out to him? What did he even do now? But one truth was already crystal clear. Whatever came next, he wasn't leaving these girls behind. Not again. Back in the car, the silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. Jonathan had buckled the girls into the back seat carefully, checking twice to make sure everything was secure. They sat quietly, staring out the windows as he pulled onto the road, their small faces full of something heavier than any child should have to carry. He glanced at them in the rearview mirror more than once, his mind moving faster than the car could drive. He had no plan, only questions, only instinct, only a growing sense that something irreversible had just happened and he wasn't ready for it, but he also couldn't ignore it. His first destination was a small diner a few miles from the cemetery. He needed time to think, and more than that, he needed to make sure the girls ate something. When they arrived, he walked them inside gently, his hands hovering behind them protectively, like a father who wasn't yet sure if he had the right to be one. The waitress raised an eyebrow at the sight of him with two small children, but said nothing as she guided them to a corner booth. He ordered them grilled cheese sandwiches and apple juice. He ordered coffee for himself and didn't touch it. As the food arrived, the girls ate in silence, too polite to speak but too hungry to wait. Jonathan watched them, thinking about all the things he'd missed. Their first steps. Their first words. Their birthdays. Every moment that should have been his to witness had slipped through his fingers before he even knew they existed. And the more he thought about it, the more his regret turned into something colder, sharper, anger. Not at them. Not even at Emily. But at himself. For being so buried in his own ambition that he had never stopped to wonder if she needed him, if she had tried to reach out and given up. He cleared his throat as the girls finished their meal. "Can I ask you something?" he said gently. They both nodded, wiping their hands on napkins. "Did your mom ever talk about me?" Sarah looked uncertain. Sophie, always bolder, answered first. "She had a picture of you in her drawer. Sometimes she'd look at it and smile, but sometimes she'd cry." Jonathan felt something twist inside his chest. "Did she ever say who I was?" "She said your name once. She said you used to be her favorite person," Sophie whispered, looking down at her empty cup. "She said you were gone, but not bad." Sarah added quietly, "She said maybe one day we'd meet you." Jonathan sat back, overwhelmed by the quiet weight of those words. Emily hadn't poisoned them against him. She hadn't erased him. She'd held on to hope, even as her life unraveled. He felt tears begin to prick the back of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't fall apart now. Not in front of them. He paid the bill and led the girls back to the car. This time, when they climbed in, they seemed just a little more relaxed. Sarah even hummed softly to herself as she buckled her seatbelt. Jonathan got behind the wheel and took a breath before starting the engine. He needed answers. And there was only one person he could think of who might have them. He drove to the small neighborhood on the edge of town where Emily had lived. The houses were older, lined with cracked sidewalks and leaning fences. It didn't look like the kind of place where someone with terminal illness should have had to raise two children alone. He parked outside a weathered one-story home and turned to the girls. "Is this where you lived with Miss Diane?" They both nodded. He walked with them to the front door and knocked. After a few moments, the door opened to reveal a tired-looking woman in her 60s. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes widened when she saw the man standing on her porch. "Mr. Blake?" she asked, almost in disbelief. "I didn't think I'd ever see you." "You know who I am?" he asked. "Of course I do," she said, glancing down at the girls. "You better come in." Inside, the house was modest and clean but worn at the edges. Toys were tucked neatly in corners, and children's drawings were pinned to the fridge. Miss Diane motioned for them to sit. The girls went straight to the couch, familiar with the space. Jonathan remained standing. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked, trying to keep the frustration from cracking through his voice. Diane sighed and shook her head. Emily didn't want to burden you. She said you had your life. She was proud, you know. Stubborn. But I think deep down she hoped you'd find out one day. Why didn't she reach out herself? She wrote you a letter, Diane said. Before she died. I have it. She walked into the other room and returned a moment later with a sealed envelope. Jonathan took it, his fingers trembling. He stared at the handwriting on the front. It was unmistakably Emily's. For a long time, he couldn't bring himself to open it. Diane spoke softly. She loved them more than anything. She did her best. But it wasn't enough. And now well, they need someone. They need you. Jonathan finally opened the letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated just a few weeks before Emily's death. She explained everything, how she found out she was pregnant just weeks after their divorce, how she wanted to tell him but didn't know how she thought about it every day, but the years passed and pride took root. She wrote about the girls, their laughter, their stubborn streaks, how much they reminded her of him. And at the end, she wrote only this. If you find them, please love them. Even if you don't forgive me. Jonathan folded the letter with shaking hands. He looked across the room at Sarah and Sophie, curled up on the couch, sharing a blanket, already beginning to drift off after a long and confusing day. He turned to Diane. I want to take them with me. Not just for today. For good. Diane's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I hoped you'd say that. Jonathan knew the road ahead would be hard. The courts, the questions, the logistics, it would all come. But right now, all he saw was two little girls asleep on a couch, and the second chance he never thought he'd get. And he wasn't going to waste it. Jonathan woke up the next morning in a place he never expected to be, the guest bedroom of Diane's modest house, on a creaky twin mattress with the sound of birds chirping outside and soft footsteps padding through the hallway. The previous night had passed in a blur. After the girls fell asleep, Diane insisted he stay the night, and he hadn't had the heart to argue. Something about the stillness of that small house, the lived-in warmth of it, kept him grounded. But now, as sunlight streamed through the half-closed blinds and his suit jacket hung limply over a wooden chair, he felt the enormity of what had happened the day before pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, trying to process everything. He had two daughters. They had lost their mother. And they were still in shock, still unsure who he really was. He couldn't just swoop in and take them like some heroic figure from a storybook. Trust didn't work that way. It had to be built, piece by piece. And right now, those pieces were scattered between his past failures and an uncertain future. He stepped into the hallway and found Diane already awake, standing at the stove flipping pancakes. The scent of butter and batter filled the air. She gave him a soft nod, acknowledging both the morning and the unspoken truth between them. They're still asleep, she said, glancing toward the other end of the hall. Didn't say much last night. I think it's still sinking in. I can't even imagine what's going through their minds, Jonathan replied, running a hand through his hair. I barely know what's going through mine. Diane turned off the stove and placed the pancakes on a plate. They're strong girls. But they've been through more than you know. You're going to need patience. They don't trust easily. I don't expect them to, he said quietly. I just want to be there. I want to earn it. They sat at the small kitchen table, sipping coffee in silence. Jonathan stared at his cup, feeling both grateful and helpless. He had all the resources in the world, money, property, influence, but none of that mattered here. What mattered was showing up, day after day, and proving he was worthy of the title he'd never expected to carry, father. A little while later, the sound of soft voices drifted from the hallway. Sarah and Sophie emerged, still in their pajamas, hair tousled from sleep. Sophie clung to a small stuffed bear, while Sarah clutched the letter from their mother in her tiny hand. Jonathan stood instinctively but didn't move toward them. He didn't want to overwhelm them. Instead, he offered a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said. They both nodded cautiously, unsure of how to respond. Diane broke the tension by inviting them to the table. The girls climbed into the chairs beside her, and she served them pancakes with syrup and fruit. They ate quietly, casting occasional glances toward Jonathan, who sat across from them, trying to appear calm, trying not to let the emotion in his chest rise too close to the surface. After breakfast, Diane pulled Jonathan aside. "If you're serious about taking them, you need to get a lawyer. Petition for custody. Until then, technically, I'm still their guardian." Jonathan nodded. "I'll make the calls today. I want to do this the right way." Diane looked at him with a rare softness. "Then you need to start now. With them. They need to know you're not just another adult who's going to disappear." He understood. So instead of returning to his penthouse apartment or his downtown office, Jonathan canceled every meeting on his calendar and stayed in town. He found a local hotel and booked a suite with a kitchen and 2 bedrooms. That afternoon, he asked Sarah and Sophie if they wanted to come spend some time with him, just to talk, maybe watch a movie. They hesitated, but Diane gently encouraged them, reminding them that they didn't have to do anything they didn't feel comfortable with. The girls agreed. They rode with him in quiet tension, watching the town go by from the back seat of his luxury car. When they arrived, he gave them a quick tour, showed them where the snacks were, and let them pick out a movie. He didn't try too hard. He didn't force conversation. He just let them exist in the space with him. During the movie, Sophie curled up next to him on the couch without a word. A small, quiet gesture, but it hit him like a wave. Sarah stayed a bit more distant, sitting on a separate chair with her arms crossed, but even she laughed once, at a silly cartoon moment, and Jonathan caught it and held onto it like a priceless treasure. Later that evening, as he drove them back to Diane's, Sophie surprised him again by asking, "Can we come back tomorrow?" Jonathan smiled. "Of course. Anytime you want." At the door, Sarah paused before going inside. She looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to leave again?" He crouched down, so they were face to face. "No," he said firmly. "I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." She didn't say anything in response, but she nodded, just once, and walked inside. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was a beginning. And for Jonathan, that was everything. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. Jonathan, who once measured time by stock prices and quarterly earnings, now began to measure it in small, quiet moments, braiding tangled hair in the morning, pouring cereal without spilling milk, and reading the same bedtime story 3 nights in a row because Sophie insisted it was the only one where the bear got it right. The suite at the hotel had started to feel less like a temporary space and more like a fragile sanctuary, a middle ground between 2 broken lives now slowly stitching themselves together. Every morning, Jonathan picked the girls up from Diane's house, and every evening he brought them back. At first it was just for short visits, an hour, maybe 2, but soon they were spending the full day with him, eating lunch together, doing crafts at the hotel's little dining table, watching movies, and even taking short walks to the nearby park. He introduced them to ice cream flavors they had never tried and let them choose clothes from a small local store when he noticed their shoes were too tight. He didn't ask for hugs, but when Sophie began giving them without warning, he held her a little longer each time, silently thanking the universe that this tiny soul had let him in. Sarah remained more cautious. She watched everything with the silent awareness of a child who had seen too much and trusted too little. She always stayed a few steps behind, always had one eye on her sister, as if trying to protect her from what might go wrong. Jonathan never pushed her. Instead, he gave her space. He let her choose when to speak, when to play, when to simply sit and listen. He offered quiet invitations rather than commands, and slowly, the walls she had built began to crack. One day, while they were painting with watercolors on the hotel balcony, she looked up and asked him to help her draw a cat. It was small, maybe meaningless to someone else, but to him, it was everything. It was a key turning in a long rusted lock. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the legal process had begun. Jonathan had called his most trusted lawyer, explained the situation in full detail, and asked that everything be done by the book. He wanted no shortcuts. He didn't want to be perceived as a man using wealth to force a reunion. He wanted to be seen as a father making things right. The paperwork for emergency custody had been filed, and though it would take time, Diane's full cooperation helped move things forward faster than expected. She had no intention of standing in his way. If anything, she had become something of an ally, quietly advising him on the girls' routines, helping bridge the gap between old life and new. But not everyone was as supportive. Late one afternoon, Jonathan received a call from Emily's older sister, Rachel. She was furious. She accused him of coming back out of guilt, of trying to erase the years he had missed by playing the savior now. She reminded him of the pain Emily had carried, the nights she cried over the life they were supposed to have. Rachel had never liked him much, and now she saw his return as both selfish and opportunistic. He listened quietly, letting her anger pour out. He didn't defend himself, not because he agreed, but because he knew she was speaking from grief, not hatred. When she finally asked him why he thought he deserved to be in their lives now, he answered simply, "Because I'm their father. Because I love them. And because I won't abandon them again." The line was silent for a long moment before she sighed and said, "Then don't fail them." He promised he wouldn't. That night, he took the girls out to a quiet hill outside of town where you could see the stars clearly without city lights. He brought a blanket, a flashlight, and a book about constellations. They lay on their backs, pointing to shapes in the sky, turning imaginary dots into dragons and ships and flowers. It was the first time he had heard Sarah laugh without hesitation. Sophie curled up next to him as the evening grew cooler, and he pulled the blanket tighter around them. "Do you think Mommy can see us from up there?" Sophie asked quietly, looking at the stars. "I think she's watching all the time," Jonathan said. "And I think she's proud of you. Both of you." Sarah turned her head toward him. "Would she be proud of you?" He didn't answer right away. "I hope so," he said finally. "I'm trying to be someone she would be proud of." Neither girl said anything, but they didn't need to. The silence that followed was soft and full and peaceful. And as they lay there under the open sky, Jonathan realized that this exact moment, was more real, more important, than anything he had ever built before. It wasn't about undoing the past. It was about showing up for the future. And he was finally ready. The following week brought a mixture of calm and quiet storms. On the surface, the routine continued just as it had before, morning pickups from Diane's house, afternoons filled with drawing, playing, and slow attempts at building trust. But under the surface, something else was shifting, within Jonathan, within the girls, and within the town that had once forgotten him. It started with a visit from the family court representative, a woman named Evelyn Marks. She arrived at the hotel room unannounced, clipboard in hand, her tone professional but not unfriendly. Jonathan welcomed her in, trying not to show how unprepared he felt. Sarah and Sophie were in the living room playing with blocks. Evelyn observed them quietly, made notes, then asked to speak to him privately. They moved to the small balcony. She asked questions he'd been dreading. Why had he never been involved in their lives until now? Why had Emily not listed him on the birth certificates? Did he believe he could provide not just financial support but emotional stability? What would he do if the court denied him custody? Jonathan answered each one as honestly as he could. He admitted his absence. He explained his ignorance. He didn't try to excuse what he hadn't done, only to describe what he was doing now and why it mattered. Evelyn listened without giving much away. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't warm either. Just neutral. After the interview, she knelt by the girls and asked if they felt safe. Sarah said yes. Sophie nodded. Then Sarah added, "He makes us pancakes with chocolate chips," which made Evelyn smile faintly before scribbling something down. Later, after she left, Jonathan felt something he hadn't expected: relief. It wasn't because he believed everything was settled. It was because he had faced something that once would have made him run. He didn't hide. He didn't falter. That, in itself, was progress. But just as that tension began to ease, another challenge arrived. It came in the form of a letter, slipped under his hotel room door one afternoon while the girls were napping. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal notice. Michael Carter, Emily's ex-boyfriend and the man listed as the girl's guardian in some temporary capacity after her death, had filed a motion to assume custody of Sarah and Sophie. Jonathan sat down slowly, the paper shaking slightly in his hands. He remembered Michael. They had met briefly, once, years ago, when Emily was trying to start over after their divorce. Jonathan never thought much of him at the time, just another man passing through her life. But now, apparently, he wanted to claim the girls. Diane was just as shocked when he called her. She had thought Michael had left town, long ago. He never acted like he cared about those girls, she said. He barely visited when Emily was sick. Why would he want them now? Jonathan wasn't sure, but he had his suspicions. The girls were Emily's legacy. Maybe Michael saw them as leverage, or maybe he had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. Either way, the situation had changed. Now, it wasn't just about proving he was the right choice, it was about protecting the girls from someone who might not have their best interests at heart. He contacted his lawyer immediately, who assured him that they were on solid ground. Still, it would require a hearing. Testimony. Evidence. And worst of all, questions that would be asked in front of the girls. Jonathan didn't want them to be pulled into another storm after everything they had just begun to recover from. The next few days were heavy. Jonathan didn't mention the letter to the girls, but he could feel their sensitivity returning. Sarah began biting her nails again. Sophie stopped asking for bedtime stories. They could feel the shift even if they didn't understand it. One night, as he tucked them into bed at the hotel, Sarah looked at him and said, "Are we leaving soon?" The question hit him hard. He sat down beside her and smoothed the blanket over her shoulders. "Why would you think that?" She stared at the ceiling. "Because good things don't last. That's what Mommy said once." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "This is going to last," he said. "I can't promise things won't be hard sometimes. But I'm not going anywhere. No matter what." Sarah didn't respond, but the way she shifted closer told him she was listening. That night, after they had fallen asleep, Jonathan sat alone in the dark hotel living room, the city lights flickering through the windows, and he made a quiet vow. Whatever it took, he would fight. Not just for legal rights. Not just for appearances. But for the trust of two little girls who had been let down too many times already. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But he would show up. He would stay. And in the world they were slowly building together, that would mean everything. The courtroom was smaller than Jonathan had imagined, with dull beige walls and a single row of wooden benches that creaked every time someone shifted. Despite its simplicity, the atmosphere inside was heavy, thick with tension and unspoken fears. Sarah and Sophie weren't there, they had been left in Diane's care for the day, as both lawyers agreed it would be too traumatic for them to be present. Still, Jonathan could feel their presence with him like a heartbeat. He had promised them he wouldn't leave, and now everything hinged on what happened in this room. Across from him sat Michael Carter, dressed in a sharp gray suit that didn't quite match the discomfort on his face. Jonathan studied him quietly, remembering only fragments from years ago, how Michael had always lingered a little too long near Emily, how he'd reappeared after the divorce like a shadow in the periphery of her life. Jonathan hadn't thought of him much until now, and even then, he hadn't expected this. Michael had filed for custody as a known and consistent adult presence in the girls' lives, citing brief moments of caretaking and offering financial support during Emily's illness. His legal team was efficient, presenting a version of the truth that was technically accurate, though deeply incomplete. Jonathan's lawyer had prepared well. She spoke of DNA evidence, of emotional bonding, of Jonathan's efforts since discovering the girl's existence. They submitted testimony from Diane, statements from Evelyn Marks, and even drawings the girls had made, unprompted, just simple pictures of a man, 2 little girls, and a house with a heart over the roof. Jonathan didn't look at the judge while this was being read aloud, he stared at his hands and tried not to break down. When it was Jonathan's turn to speak, he stood, heart pounding, and looked directly at the judge. He didn't use a script. He didn't rehearse. He spoke from a place of deep, unshakable love. He explained everything, how he hadn't known about the pregnancy, how Emily never reached out, how he'd come to the cemetery that day only intending to say goodbye to the past, and how instead, he found the future staring back at him with teary eyes and red sweaters. He told the court what he had learned in just a few weeks. How Sarah didn't like raisins in her cookies and how Sophie talked in her sleep when she was worried. How they both insisted on feeding the ducks the small bread pieces, because big ones make them choke, and how they danced like no one was watching when they thought they were alone. He spoke about the guilt that nearly swallowed him and the grace the girls had shown in letting him try anyway. He admitted he hadn't been there when it mattered most. But now, he was here. And he wasn't running. When he sat down, the courtroom was silent. Even Michael looked shaken, his bravado dulled. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind but tired eyes, recessed briefly to consider the ruling. Jonathan stepped outside, needing air, and sat on a cold bench beneath an overcast sky. It felt like the world was holding its breath. He thought about what he would say to the girls if things didn't go the way they hoped. How could he tell them goodbye again? How could he accept that this one chance, this impossible, miraculous second chance, was gone? But an hour later, back inside that quiet courtroom, the judge returned and read the decision. She acknowledged Michael's claim, his legal standing, and his limited contributions. But she also acknowledged the deeper truth, that love, consistency, and a child's sense of safety could not be built from mere proximity. Jonathan Blake, she ruled, had not only shown intent to care for the girls, he had already begun to succeed. The court granted him full legal custody, effective immediately. Jonathan's hands trembled as he tried to process what he had just heard. He stood there frozen until his lawyer gave him a subtle nudge. Then it sank in. It was real. He didn't cry, not until he was alone again. Not until the door closed behind him and he slumped against the hallway wall, heart pounding, overcome by the weight of relief. Later that evening, he returned to Diane's house to pick up the girls. They ran to him when they saw his face, and though he hadn't said a word, they somehow knew. Children had a way of sensing these things. Sarah hugged him first, fiercely and without hesitation. Then Sophie wrapped her arms around his waist and whispered, "Can we go home now?" Jonathan knelt down, kissed both of their foreheads, and said, "Yes. Let's go home." It wouldn't be perfect. There would still be moments of sadness, of anger, of longing for the mother they had lost. But they had gained something too, a father who had once walked away but now would walk through fire to stay. And for the first time, it felt like the future was not just possible, but already beginning. The first morning in their new home felt surreal. The sun poured in through large windows in the kitchen, casting warm light across the wooden floors. The walls, freshly painted in soft pastels chosen by Sarah and Sophie themselves, still smelled faintly of clean beginnings. The girls padded across the floor in their socks, Sophie wearing her favorite red sweater even though the weather was already warming, and Sarah trailing behind with a book tucked under her arm. Jonathan stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with a mixture of determination and mild panic, trying to remember which one preferred syrup and which one liked hers with fruit only. This wasn't just a temporary visit or a borrowed afternoon. It was home. Their home. The court had made it official, but more than that, something between the three of them had solidified. Trust that had been tentative now felt earned, delicate but real. Jonathan had bought the house in a quiet neighborhood not far from where Diane lived, choosing it not for its size or status but for its safety, its yard, and the sunlight that streamed into the kitchen like a quiet blessing. For once, the decision had nothing to do with investment or market value. It was simply a place he could imagine watching them grow up. The breakfast turned into a messy, laughing affair, with syrup spilled across the counter and Sophie dropping blueberries under the table on purpose just to watch Jonathan crawl under to pick them up. Sarah read aloud from her book as they ate, and Jonathan listened to every word like it was a song he'd never heard before. It was chaotic, imperfect, and better than anything he had ever experienced in all his years of running companies and collecting accolades. He had spent his life chasing excellence, and now he was learning that joy didn't come from perfection. It came from burnt pancakes and crooked pigtails and small voices calling him "Daddy" without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, the house began to take on a rhythm of its own. Mornings were a blur of mismatched socks and brushing tangled hair, school lunches packed with notes folded inside, and kisses blown from the driveway. Jonathan hired a tutor to help them transition gently into a school routine but kept the pace flexible. He wanted them to feel steady before pushing them into the larger world. Afternoons were filled with long walks, visits to the park, and craft projects that left glitter embedded in the carpet. Evenings were quiet, story time, bath time, and moments that seemed to expand with meaning the more ordinary they were. Jonathan started writing again, something he hadn't done since college. He found himself journaling late into the night, not about business plans or strategic forecasts but about the small things. Sophie's fascination with insects. Sarah's quiet, careful questions about the stars. The way both girls said "good night" with a finality that made every day feel sacred. He began to understand that parenthood wasn't something you mastered. It was something you chose, every single day, with presence and humility. Diane visited often. She remained a steady presence in the girls' lives and a trusted voice in Jonathan's. There were days when he felt overwhelmed, when one of the girls cried for no clear reason, or when nightmares crept into Sophie's sleep and she refused to explain what had scared her. Diane would offer advice gently, reminding him that healing wasn't linear and that love wasn't measured in how many problems he could fix but how many times he was willing to stay through the storm. One afternoon, Jonathan found Sarah sitting alone in the backyard, her gaze distant. He sat beside her quietly, waiting. After a long pause, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think Mommy would have liked this house?" He took her hand and nodded. "I think she would have loved it. I think she would have loved seeing you grow up here." Sarah didn't cry, but she rested her head against his arm and stayed like that for a long time. It was in these moments, the wordless ones, that he felt closest to her. Not everything needed to be said aloud to be understood. By the end of the first month, they began to feel like a family, not just by name or by law, but in the deep, unshakable way that grows from shared mornings and mended hurts. Jonathan knew he would never replace Emily, and he never tried to. Her memory remained a quiet presence in their home, a photograph on the bookshelf, stories the girls shared at bedtime, traits of hers he began to recognize in them more and more. But he had become something else entirely. He had become their anchor. Their protector. Their home. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Blake understood what it meant to build something not with money or influence, but with patience, gentleness, and relentless love. He had spent years chasing the world, only to discover that everything he had truly needed had been waiting for him all along, in the voices and laughter of two little girls who called him Dad. This ending feels like a quiet, powerful redemption. It doesn't rely on grand gestures or sudden miracles, but instead grows through vulnerability, choice, and the slow rebuilding of broken connections. Jonathan's journey, from a distant, successful man unaware of the life he left behind to a present, devoted father, is both heartbreaking and healing. What makes the conclusion resonate is that it doesn't erase the past, it acknowledges it with honesty and grief, while still offering hope. The girls, too, aren't magically fixed by love, they carry their pain, but they begin to trust again. That's what gives the ending its emotional weight. It's not about a perfect family, but a real one, built on effort, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again.